Well, hey there, folks. Thanks for joining me on my YouTube channel today. Glad to have you here. It's Dr. Simeon Hine back with you for another YouTube episode, and to commemorate reaching over 9,000 subscribers and the re-release new edition coming out of my book, Black Swan Ghosts, I'm starting a new mini-series here on my YouTube channel called MISIDENTIFIED, where science meets the paranormal. And the goal and the point behind this miniseries is to look at phenomena that may have been, probably were completely misidentified and misunderstood by all sides, so that they really remain quite mysterious because we don't know how to think about them properly. And I think the first episode that we should have of Identified is the drones, the Colorado drones, Nebraska drones. And these drones have been making the news again recently over at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia and other places. I went over to eastern Colorado, to Lyman, Colorado, if you'll remember, back in late 2019, early 2020. It's not all that far from Boulder, Colorado, and people out there had been seeing these drones. So I was really curious to talk to some folks on the ground and go out there. And I drove out to Lyman, which is a couple hours from here. And it wasn't very hard to find people that knew about these mystery drones. There had been articles in the New York Times about these mystery drones, so-called mystery drones. And just talking to people around the town in restaurants and coffee shops and stuff, just about everyone knew someone who had seen these so-called mystery drones. So the thing about the drones is, first of all, we have this sort of mental map in our minds that we get from reading things and listening to authority figures and talking to people and so forth. And when we see blinking lights, groups of objects flying around in formation, we just automatically think drones, right? I mean, human-made drones. So the thing about these drone swarms, they were all over the eastern part and the kind of northeastern part of Colorado, going down to central Colorado. You can take a look at this map from one of the news reports about it. They were up into Wyoming, across way into Nebraska, and even into Kansas. And people really didn't know what else to call them but drones. At the time I went out to Lyman, there had been a task force assembled from 16 of the sheriff's jurisdictions, 16 of the counties out in that direction, to talk about this. It had just been held a couple days earlier, and each of the departments had deputies who had seen these so-called drones. And the descriptions of them were that they had red, green, and white blinking lights. They were not small drones. These are not the hobbyist type of drones, the type that you and I might buy for several hundred to $1,000 or something like that. The type you can get over, at Costco or someplace like this. These were drones with 6-foot wingspans. These were large aerial vehicles, unidentified and aerial phenomena, if you will. And they were very fast. I remember talking to one of the witnesses who said they had a friend that worked at one of the correctional facilities out in Lyman, and he was driving home on the highway on 70, going over the speed limit. I think the speed limit out there is 75 miles per hour. He was speeding, and this drone, he said, passed over his car not too far up, faster than he was driving. So those are pretty fast drones. Some of the sheriffs reported that they didn't make any sound. Now, have you ever been around any drones that you knew were drones that didn't make any sound? Because all the drones I've ever been around made mosquito-like buzzing sounds as the variable speed of the propellers and so forth changed. So these were large vehicles with 6-foot wingspans, and I didn't know all of this at the time as much as I know about it now. Large vehicles, a couple 100 feet above the ground, in groups, often silent, blinking lights, and unidentified. Now, one other feature of these so-called drones is it was reported that there was a mothership, a larger drone around these smaller drones. Have you ever heard of anything like that before? And there was some report of it possibly landing at an airport in Nebraska and taking off again. Now, none of the reports that I ever read or any of the witnesses I talked to out in eastern Colorado ever suggested there was any sort of criminal intent on the part of these drones. They always appeared at night, and they went as far down, I believe, as central Colorado Springs area. Again, all the way out to eastern Nebraska, a really large range. And they were seen sometimes for as long as 90 minutes. So that is very long for a drone that we are familiar with to stay in the air, a conventional drone. The drones that I'm familiar with don't stay in the air for 90 minutes that I've been around. And I'm not a drone expert. And this is a very, it's a complex subject. There's a lot that's been written about it, and I'll put the details in the links below. So if you look at the articles about these drones and following up on it, it really appeared that the FAA took this very seriously. And there was an investigation, also the Department of Transportation. And from what I'm able to read, nothing was uncovered as to the source of these drones. I mean, nothing. The internal Air Force documents that people were able to get from FOIA requests seem to show all the different Air Force bases, all the way from Warren, F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming, all the way down to Buckley in Aurora, Colorado, all the way down to Colorado Springs Air Force bases, that whole military complex down there. The internal emails seem to suggest that none of them knew what this was. And if you look at some of the articles about these drones, the Air Force made a statement to the FAA involving all of their top sub-organizations within the Air Force that none of them knew what the origins of these drones were. And so eventually the Secretary of Transportation, Elizabeth Chu, I believe, came out with a statement saying that they simply didn't know the origin of these drones. Now, if we look at some of the reporting, if you take a look at this article from the War Zone, newly released FAA documents give unprecedented look into Colorado drone swarm mystery. Hundreds of pages of documents provide consistent, detailed descriptions of drones and conclude the military wasn't behind the operation. But I will read you just the summary of Douglas D. Johnson, who you may have come across on Twitter, who works for the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, SCU, with a FOIA request. And he said that the mystery drone flap had serious attention from top FAA leaders and at least 2 senators. Investigators were assigned to look into this. Someone came up from, I believe it was from San Diego, to look into this, one of the top FAA people. There was limited assistance from the FBI, DHS, because there wasn't any intent established to what these drones were doing. When I spoke to one of the witnesses, she said she knew a farmer that saw this drone swarm. All it was doing, a very remote area in eastern Colorado, northeast of Lyman, if I remember correctly. And she said, this farmer said it just hovered over the fields. Like, what was it doing out there for quite a while with no obvious purpose? So Once the aerial activity stopped, according to Johnson, it appears that both federal and state agencies quickly dropped the matter, and I've not seen any evidence of a continuing federal investigation. And it goes on and on. There's all these documents you can take a look at. And it just goes on to the general characteristics between 200 to 300 feet in height, 2 to 3 hours of continuous flight. Wow. In high winds and storm-like conditions, 2 to 16 at a time, 16 feet in length. And larger ones were seen over Nebraska, sometimes in grid-like patterns. Farmers, ranchers reporting them over their farmsteads. The big drone mothership that was seen near there. And it just keeps going on and on. It's absolutely fascinating. So you really have to ask yourself, are these drones? If they are drones, why weren't any of them, captured, neutralized? There are, anti-drone weapons that jam their GPS and prevent them from knowing where they are, which cause them to land. And you have to ask this because these types of drones were also seen in different places that I didn't know about at the time. Apparently, there was the incidents over the USS Kidd off the coast of California in, 2019? 3 nights, I believe, of drone swarms over this naval group off the coast of California. And so this is incurring into a naval, operational zone. And we're told that these were unidentified. And if we looked at some of the video of those, they also had the same types of blinking lights, red, green. Now, keep in mind, I once went to private pilot ground school during graduate school at the University of Arizona. Just in my free time. Took a few lessons. I didn't go all the way to get my private pilot's license. It was expensive on a graduate student salary, to get the flight time. So what are we actually dealing with here? So I came across this fascinating article from Marek von Rennenkamp, a contributor to thehill.com. And von Rennenkamp is, according to what I read about him, a former State Department employee. He's been writing a lot about the UFO issue. And if you haven't read his articles, you should, because this is someone that's coming from the inside of the U.S. government. He doesn't seem to have any preconceived ideas about UFOs, but he's been writing some very interesting pieces in The Hill. And he had an article about these drone swarms because most recently they've been showing up over Langley Air Base in Virginia near the naval complex, Norfolk and Hampton Roads naval bases. And so over Langley Air Force Base, which is in the vicinity of the naval base, Norfolk and Hampton, Virginia Beach. And what von Rennenkamp has been pointing out is that you've had this same sort of drone swarm happening recently over Langley Air Base. Again, none of the objects were identified, and it was sufficient for them to call in one of the top surveillance aircraft in the U.S. military, so to speak, military fleet from NASA, the WB-57 plane, which can do surveillance, fine-tuned surveillance over large areas. And there are maps here of this plane, flying in low circles over Langley to figure out what these drones were. So the impact is to show us that these drone swarms are not just something that's limited to eastern Colorado and Nebraska and Kansas and parts of Wyoming. This is something that's been happening, if they're the same sorts of vehicles, over air bases and over naval groups out in the ocean. And you really sort of have to wonder if they're incurring into military airspace, why none of them have been captured with anti-drone warfare systems, which we know exist, as people have been pointing out recently. If the U.S. and Israel were able to neutralize something like 99% of missiles a few weeks ago, why aren't they able to neutralize and take down some of these drones? Well, I think there are two possible answers here. I think, for one thing, maybe these aren't drones at all. If you look at some of these websites like the War Zone, they take the view that these are adversarial, weapons, drones from other countries that are harassing our naval ships and carrier groups and so forth. But there's still no evidence for that directly. And again, you'd have to wonder, if that was happening, why wouldn't they just want to capture one of these and show it off in a press conference to show that other countries are acting in a hostile way and sending drones over, our military assets and over remote locations in eastern Colorado? I mean, where's the evidence for that? And in one of these comments from the FAA, they say that in other times, these objects just would have been called UFOs, perhaps smaller UFOs, but UFOs nonetheless. And perhaps we're calling them drones in the same way that UFOs have been relabeled as UAP, just to give them a more politically correct name so various agencies can study them without fear of stigma. Stigma are accused of being, being interested in fringe paranormal topics and so forth. I mean, so I think that is one possibility, that these are really not explainable. They've been misidentified. They've been interpreted as being terrestrial vehicles. Now, it is weird that they have flashing lights. I mean, if you were attempting to do something in a covert way, would you put flashing lights? What is the purpose of non-standard flashing lights? Unless it means something to whoever sent these objects up. I mean, UFOs do have flashing lights occasionally. One of the witnesses I spoke to for Black Swan Ghost, Luis Voves, who's in one of the chapters here, describes picking huckleberries with her brother in Usk, Washington, and having a classic, and this is the 70s, a classic 70s disc come over the field, the kind of falling leaf pattern. It's wobbling, and she said there were typical lights going around this object, though as it left, it seemed to flatten the plants in the field as it whisked away. And so you have to wonder what the lights are for. I think there's another possibility here too. If the military really tells us from all of these Air Force, emails and communications between the different Air Force bases up and down the Front Range here, Colorado, Wyoming, if they're all saying they had no idea what these are, then is it possible at the other end that this is some super extreme secret special access program that, one of these WUSAPs, waived unacknowledged special access programs, as they're called? Is this a type of WUSAP that is just so secretive they don't have to give they don't have to give any information at all to anybody about what they're doing? Not the FAA, not anyone else in the Air Force. I mean, that would be another possibility. And that would suggest, for those of us in the U.S. here, that the entire system is different than the way we think about it. We think about this sort of hierarchy of authority and the state and federal system and the three different branches of federal government and so forth, sort of being in charge of the whole thing. This would suggest that there's a fourth branch of government that isn't accountable to the other three. And it can do what it wants. Why it would be out in those fields over the most rural parts of Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, I don't know. I did have someone whose dad had worked in the Air Force tell me that they can use inactive missile silos to launch vehicles like this, and there are a lot of silos out there. Curiously enough, though, where these drones were seen doesn't completely match where the missile silos are or where they were in the past, the ones controlled by Warren Air Force Base out in eastern Wyoming and northeastern Colorado and Nebraska. They don't really appear to match those directly, but they appear to match a lot of them. So maybe it has something to do with the missile silos out there. In any case, it's really quite a mystery as to what these drones are. Are they someone else's UFOs, a civilization that we don't know about, or are they some really secret project? Now, in Marek von Rennenkamp's article here in The Hill from 4/21, April 21, 2024, this is what really got me about this. I mean, you really should read this article if you're interested in this, because he just shows how deep this is. This is a lot more than just a couple months of swarms out in this part of the country. What he points out, which really got me thinking about this, that this is something really unexplained, was that this happened before 55 years earlier, folks. Over the course of 3 nights in 1965, just 3 nights in 1965, more than 140 Air Force personnel stationed at nuclear missile silos in the same areas of rural Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska reported nearly 150 mysterious craft demonstrating the enigmatic characteristics observed during the 2019-2020 incidents. How about that? And they also had red and green flashing lights, also at 1 to 2 second intervals, and there was no sound associated with any of the objects. And it also occurred in darkness and near darkness. So here we have the same sort of phenomena happening in 1965. And it was, again, according to Air Force documents going back from 1965. The sightings were verified by other observers, neighboring missile control centers, and it was observed by these qualified military personnel who usually know what they're looking at. So von Rennenkamp concludes that this is, whatever these are, it's some sort of glaring national security vulnerability, which it means that Congress must demand answers. I think we would agree with that. But this is what's really interesting about this, and I think it applies to a lot of the phenomena that we study on this channel, the Opening Minds channel here, is that the human memory only has a certain capacity for events from year to year. And it's very easy for a society to forget about things that don't really fit in to our worldview at the time, because it's not popular and it's not going to win you any brownie points to believe in these phenomena. Just like the phenomena nowadays, people are still hesitant. We're very hesitant to get involved with the UFO, UAP subject matter. And so if this happens in 1965 and then 55 years later, the objects come back, same sort of objects, I mean, at night, quiet, same colors of flashing lights, same periodicity for the flashing, it suggests it's the same phenomena. And we didn't have that drone capacity back in 1965. 60 years ago, as von Rennenkamp says here. So, I mean, is it some other civilization, intelligent civilization that lives amongst us that is doing some sort of surveillance for their own purposes? Or is it some long-standing special access program coming out of the back of World War II And what would they be doing out in these remote locations? Why would they be cruising over farm fields? It doesn't really make sense. But I think we have to remember that the universe doesn't have to make sense. I mean, you look at the span of our lives, the capacity of our knowledge, just how much our knowledge has expanded since you and I have been here on the planet, since we were born. There could be multitudes of phenomena that don't really show up enough to have any sort of sense of what they are. Scientists are not going to study this. It just doesn't appear enough to make it worth their time. So they're so far at the edge of our consciousness radar that we just don't pay attention to them because they only show up like twice a century. And there are other things like this, I mean, that we see occasionally that are rare black swan events that just fall off of our mental radar, our social mental radar, because they're not frequent enough. And people forget and go on, and then they show up again. And they're something. We can agree they're something, and they're intelligent, and they're structured. But we just don't have a clue. It doesn't mean they're not real. That we just don't know what they are. What's a good analogy here? Meteorites. A couple hundred years ago, people didn't believe meteorites were real. They thought they were coming from volcanoes. Volcano stones, as they were called, thrown up by lightning. The top scientists at the time, Lavoisier and Boyle, and many others, just thought it was a hoax, that this was peasant folklore. And it wasn't till a huge meteor fall in Eagle, France, I believe in 1804, that was investigated by Albert Baptiste Biot and Chladni, Ernst Friedrich Florenz Chladni, who were two scientists, a German and a French scientist, that were convinced these were meteorites. They were coming from outer space. And this fall of meteorites in 1804 in an elliptical pattern, thousands of these little stones, it was enough evidence to change the whole scientific paradigm in a short order. But in the absence of something like that happening, you could come to the same conclusion that the French Academy of Sciences came to way back then, and just say, we're looking at these meteorites and we don't think stones fall from the sky because there are no stones in the sky, so they just dumped them out of all the museums, and there are no meteorites from before 1804 in Europe in any museum, except one really huge one, apparently, that couldn't be moved. So we do have parallels in our history of phenomena that turned out to be true, but were rare enough that scientists could stick to their traditional and incorrect beliefs, rationalizing them, trying to fit into the knowledge of the time. At the time, a couple hundred years ago, that was Aristotle. And if Aristotle didn't say it was real, it wasn't real. And we can see how flawed that is. So perhaps we're guilty of the same sort of narrowed mindset where we're not really willing to look at these phenomena, or maybe the powers that be are not willing to look at these phenomena, and it's considered peasant folklore until it's proven to be true. Anyway, those are my thoughts about it. I'm always interested to hear your comments. Put your comments in the box below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video. Take care for now, and bye.